The night I drove to the Harpers, the world seemed to shrink into just the road ahead, swallowed by fog. It felt like I was heading straight into a horror movie scene, and honestly, I wasn't too thrilled about it. My name's Father Michael, and I'm not your run-of-the-mill priest. Sure, I do Sunday services, weddings, and the like, but my real calling? It's dealing with the stuff of nightmares, possessions, hauntings, you name it. So, when Mrs. Harper called me up, all frantic and scared, saying her daughter, Lily, was acting all sorts of wrong, I knew this was going to be one for the books. She was talking about voices, the stuff moving on its own, classic possession signs. But something in her voice told me that this was going to be on a whole different level of trouble. Pulling up to their place, it was straight out of a gothic novel. Big, old house, looking like it had seen better days, and the fog made it seem like it was floating. Mrs. Harper met me at the door. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Poor thing. Inside, Mr. Harper and their son Alex had the same haunted look. They told me about Lily, how she wasn't herself anymore, how she knew things she couldn't, and how she spoke in voices that weren't hers. I insisted on seeing her alone, despite the uneasy looks they exchanged. They led me to her room, and the moment they opened the door, a chill hit me like a wave. It was unnaturally cold, and the air had a heaviness to it, like walking into a storm. "Lily," I called out, stepping inside. The door shut behind me with a click that sounded too final for my liking. She was sitting on her bed, her back to me, and even from behind I could tell something was off. The air around her felt charged, and there was a faint smell of something rotten. And when she turned to look at me, her eyes were just wrong. Dark, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. And then she spoke. It was like nothing I'd ever heard. Her voice was deep, rough, filled with malice, a voice that was not her own.
"Well, the holy man comes to play."
She taunted, her words slicing through the cold air. She threw my own doubts and fears back at me, mocking me with secrets I'd never shared with anyone.
"How was it to fuck the nun? Was she tight?"
It was clear this wasn't just Lily anymore. Something else was in control. Her laughter echoed the room, a sound so sinister it made my blood run cold. She continued to taunt me, challenging my faith, my very purpose. It knew things about me, things it couldn't possibly know, trying to break me before the real battle had even begun. But as I stood there, facing this thing that had taken over Lily, something inside me clicked. This was my calling, my battle to fight, and I wasn't going to let this demon win. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this child of God," I declared, my voice stronger than I felt. The room seemed to shake with her laughter, a cacophony of voices that fought against my words. But I stood my ground. This was just the beginning, the first step in what I knew was going to be the toughest fight of my life. I was Father Michael, and I was here to bring light to the darkness, to fight for Lily's soul against whatever hell had claimed it. And so, the battle began. After that first encounter with Lily, or rather, the entity that had taken hold of her, I knew I was out of my depth. But backing down wasn't an option. The drive back to my small, cluttered office at the church was a blur of streetlights and shadows, my mind racing with every scrap of knowledge I had on exorcisms and demonic possessions. I spent the night buried in ancient texts and modern accounts, searching for anything that could give me an edge. The more I read, the clearer it became. I was dealing with something ancient, a demon that had likely been evading the church's radar for centuries. The standard rites of exorcism weren't going to cut it. I needed something more drastic. The next morning, I gathered my tools. Not just the holy water and crucifix, but also some less conventional items. Salt, for protection. An old, handwritten journal I found buried in the church's archives, containing the accounts of an exorcism performed in the 1700s. That sounded eerily similar to what I was facing. And perhaps, most importantly, a small, worn rosary that had been in my family for generations. It had always been a source of strength for me, and I had a feeling I was going to need all the strength I could muster. Returning to the Harpers' home, I could feel the weight of the task ahead. The family greeted me with a mix of hope and fear. They had done as I asked, clearing out the house to give me space to work. This was going to be a battle, and I couldn't risk anyone else getting hurt.
Ah, if it isn't my favorite priest, back again to try to save this wretched child.
It said. I ignored it. I started by setting up in Lily's room, laying out the salt in a circle and placing my tools within easy reach. The air was cold, still heavy, but I pushed through it, setting up a small altar with a crucifix and a Bible, open to Psalm 23, a reminder of the Good Shepherd, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As I began the ritual, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched, of malice hanging in the air like a thick fog. But as I continued, reciting prayers and invoking the name of God, it became more tangible. Objects began to move on their own, sliding across surfaces or tumbling on the floor. The temperature dropped even further, breath turning to mist in the air. And then Lily spoke, or rather, the demon through her. It was a cacophony of voices this time, a chorus of hate that filled the room. It knew things, personal things about me, about the Harpers, about anyone it could use to try to break our spirit. It laughed at my attempts to banish it, promising suffering and torment. But I pressed on, focusing on the ritual, on the prayers. I could feel the power of my faith, of the church behind me, like a beacon in the night. The demon fought back, with words, with force, even managing to shatter the salt circle at one point. But I repaired it, refusing to be deterred. The battle raged for hours, a test of wills between the light and the dark. There were moments when I doubted I could win, when the demon's taunt seemed too much to bear. But I thought of Lily, of the life she deserved to live, free from this darkness. I thought of the Harpers, of their faith in me, and I found the strength to push through. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, I reached the climax of the ritual. With one final, desperate plea to the heavens, I commanded the demon to leave, to return to the darkness from whence it came. The response was immediate and violent, a scream of rage and pain that shook the very foundations of the house. But then, just as suddenly, it was over. The air cleared. The temperature returned to normal, and Lily collapsed, unconscious but alive. I slumped to the floor, exhausted but victorious. The battle was won, but I knew the war was far from over. This was just one demon, one soul saved. There were more out there, more battles to be fought. But for now, Lily was safe, and that was enough. As the dust settled in Lily's room, the silence that followed the demon's expulsion was almost as unnerving as the chaos that had preceded it. I sat there on the floor, my body aching, my mind racing. Lily was safe, her breathing steady and calm, a stark contrast to the tumultuous battle we had just endured. The relief I felt was palpable, but it was tinged with an undeniable sense of foreboding. I had won the battle, yes, but at what cost? The demon's parting words, a venomous promise of return, echoed in my mind.
You can't save them all,
It had hissed, its voice a chilling blend of mockery and malice.
We'll be waiting, watching. For every soul you save, we will claim another. This is not the end, Father Michael.
The Harpers returned home, their expression a mix of relief and trepidation as they took in the scene. The room, though physically unchanged, felt different now, as if the very walls had been witness to a battle between worlds. I explained that the demon had been expelled, that Lily was safe, but I couldn't bring myself to share the entity's parting threat. In the days that followed, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Reports of strange occurrences, of shadows moving in the night, began to trickle in from around the town. It seemed that the demon's promise was more than just a parting shot. It was a declaration of war. I visited Lily often, watching as she slowly returned to her old self. The darkness that had once clouded her eyes were gone, replaced by the light of her youth. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when I would catch a glimpse of something else lurking in her gaze. A reminder, perhaps, of the darkness that had once claimed her. The Harpers spoke of moving, of starting fresh somewhere far from the memories of what had happened. I encouraged them, hoping that distance might offer them some resemblance of peace. But as I helped them pack, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The battle for Lily's soul was over, but the war was just beginning. One evening, as I sat alone in my office, poring over ancient text for my mention of the demon I had faced, I found a passage that sent chills down my spine. It spoke of a legion of demons, each bound to the other, a network of darkness that spanned the ages. The thought that I had faced just one of many was daunting. But what terrified me more was the realization that the demon might not have been lying. We were being watched, studied by an unseen enemy that lurked in the shadows. As I closed the book, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. A cold breeze whispered through the air, carrying with it the faintest hint of laughter. I stood, my heart racing as I looked around the darkened room. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, oppressive and unyielding. I realized then that this was far from over. The demon's expulsion had been a victory, but it was also a beginning. The door had been opened, and something had been let in. Something that had been waiting for just such an opportunity. The darkness was no longer confined in the shadows. It was here, among us, biding its time. And as I stood there in the dim light, I knew that the battle to come would be unlike any I had faced before. The line between our world and the next had been blurred. and the darkness was eager to cross over. The question was no longer if we could keep the darkness at bay, but for how long. And as the night closed in around me, I couldn't help but wonder, who would be next?